Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. This time, we're going to be tackling the fascinating and, let's be honest, a bit controversial life and management style of Al Dunlap.
The chainsaw.
Chainsaw Al, exactly.
Yeah.
As chronicled in his autobiography, Mean Business. Now,
A very apt title.
it is a very apt title.
Yeah.
And you've probably heard that nickname, Chainsaw Al. It's one that's followed him around.
Mm-hmm.
And it speaks to his reputation for, ruthless cost-cutting and just unwavering dedication to shareholder value. So using excerpts primarily from his book, Mean Business, we're going to delve into Dunlap's world, explore those core business principles of his, and see the impact they had, both good and bad.
I think the interesting thing is we're going to get to look at it from his perspective through his own words.
Exactly.
We get a glimpse into the man behind the nickname.
Yeah.
And see how his very unique and often contentious methods actually played out in the real world.
It's like getting a personal guided tour from the mind of a titan of industry who's not afraid to shake things up a little bit. So why don't we start with Dunlap's background? Where did this all begin? Where did this drive come from?
Well, Dunlap's story starts, humbly enough, in Hoboken, New Jersey. He came from a working-class background, and I think it was this upbringing that really instilled in him a burning ambition and a relentless drive to succeed. He kind of saw the business world as this arena where he could prove himself and constantly overcome new challenges.
There's almost this chip on his shoulder, this I'm going to prove them wrong attitude.
Yes. And I think that really fed into his single-minded pursuit of shareholder value. He was all about delivering results.
And his book really hammers home how those early experiences shaped his worldview, especially his disdain for anything he perceived as frivolous corporate spending.
Oh, absolutely. Dunlap was a firm believer that every dollar spent needed to have a direct and measurable impact on the bottom line. So things like, lavish offices and excessive perks for executives, he saw that as a betrayal of shareholder trust.
Which kind of leads into the question of how did this maximize shareholder value at any cost approach play out in real-world situations? Because I have a feeling the nickname Chainsaw Al didn't come from throwing lavish employee appreciation parties.
No, it certainly did not. His time at Lilly Tulip, I think, provides a very vivid illustration of his management style. The company was on the brink of financial ruin, saddled with significant debt, and Dunlap's solution was immediate and decisive action.
Straight to the point.
On his first day as CEO, he fired a substantial portion of the senior management team.
Sending a message.
A very clear message indeed, that the old ways were over.
The old guard is gone.
Exactly. He followed that up with a wave of cost-cutting measures, streamlined operations, and focused relentlessly on efficiency.
So he was embracing the chainsaw moniker.
He certainly was. And you have to ask, was it effective?
Right. Was it all just for show, or did it actually produce?
Well, in terms of financial outcomes, it was undeniably effective. The turnaround was quite remarkable. Lilly Tulip went from bleeding money to becoming profitable. And this really solidified Dunlap's reputation as this turnaround specialist.
At what cost, though?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, there's no escaping the fact that mass layoffs were a hallmark of Dunlap's methodology. He justified these job cuts as a necessary evil to rescue the company. But there's no denying the impact it had on employees and the communities they lived in. It was significant.
Yeah, so it's like this interesting duality with Dunlap, right? He's clearly a brilliant businessman.
Oh, yes.
But there's this undeniable harshness to his methods. Oh, yeah. Almost like a force of nature. Unstoppable, but potentially destructive.
That's a very insightful analogy, I think. To understand this force of nature, we really need to break down his 4 core business principles. These were the foundations of his approach, and he called them quite simply his simple rules.
And I remember him saying that, business schools would be out of business if everyone just followed these rules. So let's hear them. What's rule number 1?
Rule number 1, get the right management team. Dunlap was a strong believer in building lean, highly accountable teams, and he had absolutely zero tolerance for incompetence. If someone wasn't performing, he wasn't afraid to make swift personnel changes, even at the highest levels of the company.
I'm sure he has some stories about letting people go.
Oh, there are a few. There's one anecdote about a lawyer who fell asleep during an executive meeting.
Oof.
Suffice to say, it was his final nap as an employee of that company.
Wow. All right, that paints a picture. So moving on to rule number 2. What's he advocating for there?
Rule number 2 is cut costs. And he meant it quite literally. Dunlap would scrutinize every single expense, eliminate anything he deemed wasteful, and he was a master at leveraging economies of scale to negotiate favorable deals with suppliers. He even advocated for outsourcing any functions that weren't absolutely essential to the core business.
It sounds like he was really good at getting a deal. Like really.
He was. And there are many examples, but one that stands out is his procurement deal with Palgon. They were a major supplier of water treatment chemicals for Scott Paper, and by strategically consolidating their European operations under a single supplier, he achieved significant discounts and a streamlined purchasing process.
So,
Very smart.
so what about rule number 3? What's next in his arsenal?
Rule number 3, know what business you're in. Dunlap believed very strongly that companies needed to laser focus on their core competencies and then divest any assets that fell outside of that core focus.
So essentially stick to your strengths and shed anything that distracts from that.
Exactly. It's a very logical principle.
It does make sense. And finally, rule number 4. What's the last piece of the puzzle?
Rule number 4, get a real strategy. Now, this wasn't about crafting elaborate long-term plans. This was about swift execution, clearly defined goals, and a willingness to embrace calculated risks.
I'm sensing a theme here. Speed efficiency action. Dunlap's all about cutting through that corporate bureaucracy and getting results.
You've hit the nail on the head. He was all about decisiveness, even if it meant making choices that weren't always popular.
So we've got his 4 simple rules, right? Secure the right team, reduce costs, focus on what you're good at, and execute swiftly. But I feel like there's another layer to Dunlap's approach, one that's potentially a bit more controversial.
I think you're right. His views on things like executive compensation, shareholder primacy, and corporate social responsibility, those are perhaps his most debated principles.
And that's where things get really interesting. Maybe we can dig into those perspectives in the next part of our deep dive.
Well, let's talk about executive compensation because Dunlap's stance on that certainly raised a few eyebrows. He was very much of the opinion that executives should be compensated generously, but only if they delivered tangible results for shareholders.
It's very much a you get what you earn mentality.
Exactly. And, he famously received over $100 million after orchestrating the merger of Scott Paper with Kimberly-Clark.
A cool 100 million.
Yes, quite a substantial sum.
I guess that's putting your money where your mouth is in terms of performance-based compensation.
He argued that, his compensation was just a small fraction of the immense value that he created for shareholders. He saw himself as an exceptional performer and believed he deserved to be paid accordingly.
But there must have been some pushback against this idea of shareholder value above all else. I mean, what about the potential consequences for employees or communities or the environment?
Well, Dunlap's response to that kind of criticism was pretty blunt. He wasn't in business to win popularity contests. His primary objective was shareholder returns, and he saw anything else as a distraction from that goal.
It's very much a business kind of perspective.
Precisely. He believed that things like corporate social responsibility were largely a facade, a way for executives to project a positive image without actually delivering much value.
A bit cynical, but okay. Did he offer any alternative approaches or?
Well, his argument was that a truly thriving company would naturally benefit its workforce and the surrounding community through job creation and economic growth. Charitable giving, in his view, was a personal matter, not a corporate obligation.
So essentially his viewpoint was focus on market success, and that would generate positive outcomes for all stakeholders.
That's a fair interpretation. His belief system really aligned with a sort of trickle-down economics applied to the business realm. Now, it's a controversial stance, undoubtedly, but it reflects his unwavering commitment to shareholder value as the ultimate measure of success.
All right, let's turn our attention now to Scott Paper,
Okay.
because that was Dunlap's most famous turnaround, right?
It was. When Dunlap took the helm, Scott Paper was this massive entity burdened by huge debts and a bloated bureaucratic structure. It was losing money hand over fist, its stock price had stagnated, and employee morale was in the dumps.
Sounds like a recipe for disaster.
It was. How did he approach this challenge? Like, he did everything else. He came in like a whirlwind, immediately implemented his 4 simple rules, assembled a new management team, slashed costs, pinpointed the core business, and formulated a clear, actionable strategy.
I'm assuming some workforce reductions were involved.
Unfortunately, yes. Thousands of employees were laid off. Operations were streamlined, and assets that didn't align with the core business were divested.
So he brought the chainsaw to Scott Paper as well. And was it effective?
Unquestionably. Within 2 years, Scott Paper was back in the black. Its stock price soared, and Dunlap was hailed as a hero on Wall Street.
Not everyone was celebrating, though, I imagine.
No, his methods drew widespread criticism, particularly the impact of those mass layoffs on individuals and communities, but he remained steadfast in his convictions.
Okay.
He argued that his actions were necessary to save the company, and that the long-term benefits outweighed the short-term pain.
The ends justify the means.
That was very much Dunlap's perspective, and to his credit, he did deliver tangible results. But the ethical implications of his approach are still debated to this day.
Sure, so Scott Paper was a financial success. What happened next for Dunlap?
Well, his final act at Scott Paper was to orchestrate a merger with Kimberly-Clark. And this move surprised many because it didn't involve a premium for Scott Paper shareholders.
A merger with no premium. That's unusual. What was the thinking behind that?
Dunlap argued that the merger served the best long-term interests of both companies and that the combined entity would generate even greater shareholder value down the line.
So he was playing the long game, even if it meant foregoing immediate financial gains.
Exactly. And it's worth noting that Dunlap himself profited quite handsomely from this merger,
Of course.
which further fueled the debate about his true motivations.
Right. So we've delved into Dunlap's background. We've explored his 4 simple rules, his controversial views on shareholder primacy, and his high-profile turnarounds at Lilly Tulip and Scott Paper. But what about his legacy? How is he remembered today?
That is a complex question.
It is. And perhaps one we can unpack in the final chapter of our deep dive into the world of Chainsaw Al Dunlap. So journeying through the life of Al Dunlap, we've dissected his business principles and explored the controversies that surrounded him. And now we come to, I guess, really complicated question of his lasting impact. Is he a visionary, or is he just a ruthless relic of a bygone era?
Well, there's no denying that Dunlap's influence has been significant. He really brought this idea of shareholder value to the forefront of the business world. And, while his methods were often brutal, they did force companies to confront inefficiencies and really prioritize profitability.
So he kind of disrupted the status quo and pushed businesses to evolve.
Exactly. He challenged the prevailing norms and made executives really focus on delivering tangible results. In that sense, he was a real catalyst for change, someone who left an unmistakable mark on the business world.
But we can't ignore the human cost, right? I mean, mass layoffs, the impact on those communities, the business attitude, it all feels a bit at odds with, I guess, modern sensibilities.
Absolutely. Critics argue that his relentless pursuit of profit came at the expense of employee well-being and ethical considerations. And they point to the ripple effects of those layoffs, his seeming disregard for anything beyond the bottom line.
It's like this strange mix of achievement and controversy. He made businesses more efficient, but maybe at the cost of a more humane approach.
I think that's a very balanced perspective. Dunlap's legacy is complex. There's no simple answer. He left behind a trail of admirers and detractors. Some see him as a savior who rescued failing companies. Others view him as the embodiment of corporate greed.
It's a messy picture with no easy answers. It's clear that his approach was effective in the short term, but those long-term implications are a lot less certain.
That's the heart of the debate, I think. Did his laser focus on immediate outcomes, maybe compromise long-term sustainability or employee loyalty?
It begs the question, is there a middle ground? Can you be a successful leader without resorting to such extreme measures?
I think that's a great question to ponder. Dunlap's approach is one end of the spectrum, right? Efficiency and shareholder value above all else. But are there other models of leadership that achieve a better balance between profitability and ethical considerations?
The idea of being decisive without being heartless, generating shareholder value while still valuing your employees in the community.
Perhaps that's the most enduring lesson we can learn from Dunlap's story. Both his successes and his failures serve as a cautionary tale about what can happen when profit is placed above all else.
It definitely gives us a lot to chew on. We've looked at Dunlap's background, his business principles, his controversial opinions, his achievements, and the criticisms he faced. And in the end, it's up to each of us to decide how we view this complicated figure.
And I think when you take a step back, Dunlap's story really forces us to think about the fundamental purpose of business and society. Is it solely about maximizing profits, or do companies have a broader responsibility to their employees, their communities, and the world around them?
Those are questions that every business leader should grapple with. And Dunlap's story, while certainly provocative, offers a valuable framework for those critical conversations.
It reminds us that leadership is about making choices, and those choices have consequences that reverberate far beyond the balance sheet. Dunlap's career is a powerful illustration of that principle.
Well, we've reached the end of our deep dive into the world of Al Dunlap. It's been a journey filled with insights, contradictions, and I think a lot of food for thought. But before we wrap up, why don't we try to distill Dunlap's key takeaways into 10 concise points for our listeners?
Let's give it a shot. Here are 10 key takeaways from our exploration of Al Dunlap's mean business. Number one, relentless ambition. Dunlap's unwavering drive to prove himself fueled his meteoric rise in the corporate world. Number two, shareholder primacy. He was a staunch advocate for putting shareholder value above all else, a stance that often sparked controversy. Number three, the four simple rules. His management philosophy revolved around four key principles: secure the right management team, cut costs, know what business you're in, and execute your strategy swiftly. Number four, decisive action. Dunlap was all about taking swift and sometimes drastic action. He wasn't afraid to make tough choices, even if it meant mass layoffs. Number five, cost cutting mastery. He was a master at identifying and eliminating unnecessary expenses, and he used his negotiating skills to secure favorable deals with suppliers. Number six, focus on core business. Dunlap emphasized the importance of identifying your core strengths and divesting any assets that don't align with your core mission. Number seven, mergers and acquisitions. He showed a real talent for strategic acquisitions and mergers, as exemplified by the Scott Paper Kimberly Clark deal. Number eight, executive compensation. Dunlap firmly believed in performance based pay for executives, tying it directly to the returns delivered to shareholders. Number nine, controversial legacy. His methods and unwavering focus on profits sparked ongoing debate about the ethical implications of his approach. Number 10, lasting impact. Dunlap's impact on corporate management is undeniable. He forced businesses to re examine their operations, prioritize efficiency, and put shareholder value front and center.
So there you have it, 10 key takeaways from the life and times of Al Dunlap, leaving you to ponder their relevance and their implications in today's business landscape. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning.